So welcome everyone to our last week on the Gospel of John. Today, we're going to focus on, or at least the presentation part will focus just on two key passages from the first part of our reading. First, the washing of the feet in John 13, and then John chapter 17, Jesus's high priestly prayer, the longest reported prayer in the New Testament, and the topic of the chapter that we sent out for supplemental reading this week. And in doing so, I'm going to be drawing heavily from Pope Benedict, from the text that we shared, with the hope of summarizing for folks who maybe didn't get a chance to read it. I've been drawing out some particular themes that are especially connected to our Old Testament reading so far. And of course, as you've likely seen especially from that supplemental text, there's a lot of them. So to begin with, chapter 13. This is the start of what most scholars consider to be the second half or the second part of the Gospel of John. As a whole, the so-called Book of Glory. Before we were in the Book of Signs, and here is the Book of Glory. And there's a transition in theme here, especially as we arrive now at the start of chapter 13, at Jesus's hour, the hour so often foreshadowed in the first half of the Gospel, which has now arrived, and the hour to which his whole ministry has been directed from the start. So we'll start with the first verse of chapter 13. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And during supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, rose from supper, laid aside his garments, and girded himself with a towel. So there's a few aspects of this verse that I want to draw out. First, as I said, that we have now arrived at the much foreshadowed hour. And second, the two key parts of what this hour consists of. First, Jesus's departure out of this world to the Father. And second, loving his own who are in the world, loving them to the end. So the first thing I want to draw out here is both this phrase, his own, which should remind us of John from the prologue of the Gospel of John, verse 11. He came to his own home and his own received him not. So an echo there of the transformation in Jesus's reception over the course of his ministry, at least in those who were closest to him. And also that he loved them to the end. And the word here for loved is agape, and to the end is telos. So I think recognizing that this word end here, it both means an end in terms of something final, an end of time, Jesus' death, but also loving to the end, the fulfillment of something, the end to which all of Jesus's ministry has been directed. This word here, telos, also should remind us of the final, or in translation, it doesn't remind us of it, but if we look at the Greek, should remind us of John chapter 19, verse 30, the final words of Jesus, it is finished, which is also a variation of the same term. So what does it mean to love to the end? To love to the end is complete self-offering. And also, this helps us to think about what it means for Jesus to depart. Pope Benedict in his chapter on this chapter of John emphasizes that what Jesus's departure is stepping out of the limits of individuality to become one with the Father, to go to the Father, and to become one with his disciples, a theme that we'll explore especially in Jesus's high priestly prayer in chapter 17. And this is the essential content of what it means to love to the end, or what agape is, breaking out of the self into participation in the divine. And so this loving to the end, this vision of loving to the end, is the lens through which we can understand all of Jesus's actions that follow, beginning, of course, with the washing of the feet. And so foot washing in a mundane sense was an act of hospitality most normally performed by household slaves. And that might be the context with which we're most familiar, where Jesus says, if I have done this great model of humility. In a ritual context, foot washing or washing oneself, making oneself clean, is to sanctify oneself or another, to render yourself or another fit for divine worship. And washing of, and we might remember that from our reading of Leviticus and many of the texts of the Pentateuch. Washing of feet, specifically in the text of Exodus, is also associated with priestly ordination. Moses is told to wash the feet of Aaron and his sons, or the feet and hands of Aaron and his sons, on the day of their consecration, a consecration through which they receive their portion in God. And the Greek word, or the Hebrew translated into the Greek term there, is parallel to the same word that Jesus uses when he says that Peter, if he does not allow Jesus to wash his feet, will not receive the part of him. And it's that same word there. So there's something here about foot washing, a connection between foot washing, priestly ordination, and receiving, and the reception of God, the part of God, that is the essential component of that ordination. In this passage, as Benedict points out, the word clean is used 3 times. And in this, of course, John, like I said, is drawing upon a fundamental concept from the Old Testament. If man is to enter into God's presence, he must be clean. But Jesus is transforming this category, as we well know, and perhaps the most striking example of cleanness in the way that we previously encountered it, or rather maybe in the disintegration of the way we previously encountered it, is also from John's Gospel, where the Jewish leaders refused to enter the praetorium for Jesus's trial in order to not defile themselves or make themselves unclean for the celebration of Passover. This great irony where that would make them unclean, but the condemnation of the one who was sent to them, of the Messiah, then missing that aspect of uncleanness. So now let's look at how Jesus transforms this category of cleanness, both in the Gospel of John and in the other Gospels. And I want to look at this as primarily as a way of setting up what we read in John chapter 17 with the high priestly prayer, which, as I said earlier, will be the focus of most of our time. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus teaches that man is defiled, but by what arises from within rather than what enters in from outside. And purity acts the same way. It arises from within. However, this is not a simple replacement of cult with morality in the way we might be tempted to see, just like there's a temptation, I think, to see the story of foot washing, to be kind of solely Jesus acting as an example and missing the sacramental elements of what's happening here. And rather, of course, it's both, as so much is combined in Christ's action. So rather, if we trace the term clean throughout John's Gospel, we see that man's heart is made clean by a couple of different things. First, by faith. In another case, it's by word or truth, or by word, and then in a different case, by truth. That is, by contact with Christ, who is the word and who is truth. And I can show those examples here. Purity, therefore, or purity in this sense, then, is a gift from God. It's not man making himself fit to stand in God's presence, but rather through contact with God, man becomes fit to stand in the presence of God in this somewhat paradoxical way. And in this, we can see that, as I gestured to earlier, Christ's action in the washing of the disciples is not merely giving an example, though it is, of course, a great moral example, but also a reflection of the sacramental cleansing of the apostles' hearts, and the type of action that should flow from that flow from that purification and that cleansing. And so with that context, let's take a look at John chapter 17 and the high priestly prayer. And so first, the tradition of understanding John chapter 17 as a high priestly prayer goes back very far to the early church, especially because of the ways that this prayer, this very striking example of previously we had been seeing Jesus interacting with his apostles, and now Jesus looks up and addresses the Father directly. And this association between Christ and high priest specifically derives from the echoes, or from the borrowing, or Jesus's borrowing here in this prayer of the prayers of Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. And so during the liturgy of Yom Kippur, the high priest, like Jesus in his own prayer, atones for himself and for his household, and then for the whole assembly of Israel. That's a quote from Leviticus chapter 16, verse 17. So to atone for himself and for his household and for the whole assembly of Israel, the high priest first bathes himself and then enters into the Holy of Holies. So we can see the scene of foot washing is itself kind of the prelude to this recasting of the Feast of the Atonement. So the priest bathes himself and enters into the Holy of Holies. Second, he offers a sin offering of a bull to, quote, atone for himself and his household. And this is all from Leviticus chapter 16, with the bull itself hearkening back to the worship of the golden calf by Aaron and his sons. Then the high priest takes 2 goats, one, quote, for the Lord, which is sacrificed as a sin offering, quote, to atone for the uncleanness of the Israelites and for their sins. The second goat is, quote, sent off to Azazel in the wilderness after the priest lays his hands on and, quote, confesses over it all the transgressions of the Israelites and all their sins, that this goat might bear upon it all their iniquities. And we talked when we were talking about this in the context of reading Leviticus, we talked about Azazel, which is a complex figure, some associated, or a figure that's associated, or a term that's associated with the wilderness. And of course, one of the major themes we've been tracing in our readings is that of the wilderness, what it means to go out into the wilderness. The Feast of the Day of Atonement is also the one time where the high priest pronounces in God's presence the unutterable name of God, the one which was revealed to Moses at the burning bush, the great I am, that we've seen throughout the Gospel of John. And also, interestingly, it's the same day where every 7 times 7 years, the year of Jubilee or the year of release would be proclaimed, with which, of course, all of these elements being drawn into the meaning of Jesus's ministry. Through these ritual actions, the Day of Atonement is a cleansing rite for the entire nation, one that not only cleanses, but also consecrates or makes holy the nation once again, restoring Israel's character as a holy people. It's important to remember that in rabbinic theology, as Pope Benedict writes, this reconsecration held significance. This reconsecration of Israel as the people of God held significance not only for the Jewish people, but for the whole of creation. This is so because of what holiness or sanctity really means. You might recall from our conversation on Leviticus several months ago, when I emphasized the meaning of the Hebrew word for holiness, kadesh, which means set apart. So to be holy or sanctified or consecrated, to be a holy or sanctified or consecrated people is to be a people fully handed over to God, set apart for God. But as Pope Benedict also writes, the setting apart also includes an essential dynamic of existing for. Israel as a holy people is set apart from other peoples for a particular purpose. That, quote, through you all nations may be blessed. So set apart, but for a purpose, for all of humanity, and that the world may be consecrated to God. The Feast of Atonement, then, by restoring Israel's character as a holy people, also restores, as Pope Benedict writes, the harmony of creation, which was created as a place for covenant, as a place for the loving familial relationship between God and all of humanity. And through this atonement, as he writes, the inner meaning of the world is restored, that is constantly disrupted by sin. And this is the backdrop, this great cosmic backdrop, is the one against which we must understand Christ's own high priestly prayer to understand how he fulfills or realizes this atonement. So first, of course, like the high priest on the Day of Atonement, as Bert alluded to earlier, Jesus first makes atonement for himself, then for his apostles, his, quote, household, and then for all who come to believe in him. He sanctifies himself and then obtains sanctification for all who are his. However, he is the definitive high priest. He acts not only as the priest, but also offers himself as the sacrifice, with the understanding of sacrifice here being overlapping frameworks of the Passover lamb, as we saw from the very beginning of the Gospel of John, the sin offering of the Feast of Atonement, and also, perhaps also as the scapegoat, the goat that is cast into the wilderness. And as I was reading this, I was reminded, different early church fathers had different ways of mapping Jesus's life and ministry onto both of these goats. But one that came to mind for me was thinking about Luke 4 with the proclamation of the Jubilee year, after which Jesus is cast out and nearly thrown off a cliff, or all of the examples where Christ is cast out the city of Jerusalem and other Jewish cities. And that in this tradition of throwing off a cliff also later became associated with the scapegoat. But more importantly, in offering himself, Christ models and fulfills the message that is communicated also in the cleansing of the temple that we discussed last week, that substitutionary sacrifice is no more, that we're called to join ourselves to Christ's offering of himself instead, or as its deeper meaning. In Christ's prayer, and I'll close with this, we can find the meaning of true atonement or at one-ment with God. And that's what we see here in some of the texts that I have bolded on the screen. And as I was reading this, I was just so moved by this language, that all mine are yours and yours are mine. I have been glorified in them, that they may be one as we are one. And this is, of course, Christ speaking to the Father. As you have sent me into the world, so I send them into the world. And for their sakes, I sanctify myself so that they may also be sanctified in truth. That we all may be one, that you, Father, are in me and I in you, so that, or as you, Father, are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us. And perhaps the sum of this, so that the love with which you have loved me may be in them and I in them. Love, of course, being the final term here, especially sharing in the familial love of the Trinity, and that being the invitation. Or the model of atonement at one-ment that Christ is offering us here, that the incarnation offers us here. So during our discussion, some of the things we might consider are how we ourselves participate in this atonement and this communion with Christ, and therefore with the Father. And some of the passages here that we might consider would be, especially John 14, with the language here. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. So how following faithfulness to the commandments that are offered or that are told to us by Christ is the term of love, and how that those who love me will keep my word and my Father will love them. This sort of conditioned, this unconditional love, yet that is also somehow conditioned, that it's only if you keep my commands that the fullness of this love will be made manifest. Or in John 15, where we have this beautiful language of abiding, which again, we get this, if you keep my Father's commands, you will abide in my love. So I guess the invitation there would be to consider what exactly participation, what participation in this great unity in love entails for us, and calls it, and what this love calls us to. So I'll leave it there, but first opening up to Bert to add anything in.
Well, we've talked about a lot. Yeah, I think it's, gosh, well, on one of the last things you're mentioning, it's the overlapping frameworks of in Jesus's sacrifice. I also found it really interesting, the suffering servant motif from Isaiah, and like what that adds to it too, or I don't know, I was thinking like the unity of the figure of Melchizedek, like priest and king, but I feel like that figure holds together, a priest and sacrifice, and in a way that doesn't just have the cultic framework that is obviously there, but us as this other framework from Israel's history, and that especially of witness too, which is of course relevant in the context, like what in the being sent and what is community is facing. So anyway, though, we're just thinking about, the beautiful kind of tapestry of metaphors that's in images or frameworks that are overlaid, some explicitly and some not.
Yeah. So I guess first maybe to open it up to general comments, either based off of what I shared or from your own reading. And then maybe if we have time left, we can look at some of those particular passages and do more of a close reading.
Yeah. Maybe we should do this chronologically. So the first part, I was talking about the foot washing. So I think that's John 13, right? So maybe if there's anything that had mobilized someone, maybe we talk about that, and then things for the high priestly prayer and the rest of that discourse. And then maybe, that's, obviously the majority of what we were especially looking at. And then again, maybe after that, then we'll make sure there's time for talking about
Everything else. Yeah.
the little addendum.
The crucifixion, death.
Yeah, but like,
When we read Mark, we'll get.
but I mean, yeah, we're invited to see this as all one thing theologically. So that's, I mean, that's the most important thing that we could take away from this.
Yeah.
So yeah, what about
Chapter 13.
yeah. I just can't help but think, like, again, this overlaid frameworks of like the sacramental aspect of it, the priestly aspect, the obviously service, and what it means to follow Christ. That this is also the action of that a slave would take normally. I don't know. It seems like we're just invited to see paradox, and I mean to experience paradox in all of these ways. It's I don't know. It's really remarkable. Yeah. What aspect of that maybe was your attention drawn to, or hadn't come up in your reflections on this before?
Well, we'll just one thought kind of related to what Emma was saying about the foot washing is in the Gospel of John as a whole, how little moral teaching there. There's some moral teaching, but compared to the synoptics, there's not the same emphasis on ethics and morality that you've, at least that's the way that I read John, and I'm wondering how other folks read that, and what significance there is to that, if that's an accurate interpretation.
Do you mean that it's more of an exchange and service between the giver and the receiver than it is necessarily a action of holiness? It's just moving. You're clean, that once you acted as a slave, but now you act as the very opposite.
Can people hear that? That was Robbie speaking on our end. Could people hear Robbie?
Not totally. I think I got most of it.
That's gonna, I think you should just move your computer.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh,
No.
please. Thank you for. Yeah.
Actually, you want to repeat it one more time? Good. Sorry.
Yeah.
No, that's the problem. We can only have.
Sorry, I'm just joining.
Yeah.
And I feel so
Friend of the house, Robbie.
I feel so lucky to be able to speak. It seems as if it's more of an action in a relationship or a dialogue through energy than it is necessarily of one being better than the other. Oh.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, my thought was, I think along similar lines to what you were saying, Robbie, which is thinking about that, yeah, the invitation to see the foot washing here as somehow a kind of like perfect embodiment of Christ's moral teaching, of Jesus' moral teaching as we see it, as we encountered in the other gospels. So I was appreciating just reflecting on all of the ways that seems true here, this transformation of the law, of cleanness, of course, of service, of humility, and also this, as I have done, so you should also do, as this great summary of what Christ's teaching is.
Yeah.
It reminded me of that Pope Benedict's article. He has the phrase in there, the preparing them for martyrdom, and a lot of, so his humility and and teaching them to be servants, and not just servants, but martyrs. Because if you have to follow what he's doing, not just in washing the feet, but in being prepared to be martyrs in the end.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, I completely agree with what you said, Harry, but I think we're supposed to, so this isn't like a moral catechism, but a beautiful reflection on the nth degree and structure of what the moral teaching is. Like how is it essentialized in who Christ is in relation to us and in relation to God and his self-gift. And it seems that we're just invited to see. And then the commandment, like if you love me, obey my commandments. It seems that there's a positive content to that might be different, that not different than, but encapsulated with that. But there's probably something else that the Gospel of John just thought wasn't what if all the things written, if this were to contain all of the were said. Yeah, and it's interesting then to go back to then, what the gospel, what does the gospel say about itself at the end? And it says, this was written so that you may believe in Christ. And it doesn't say this was written so that you may know like exactly what to do in this touchy situation, ethically.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that there is this emphasis on, if you love me, you will keep my commandments, but not a lot of specificity about what those commandments are. It seems, which is intriguing. I'm not sure what it means.
I wonder if there's a parallel there with the sacramental themes. In a sense, like this gospel is incredibly sacramental, but it doesn't have the Last Supper in it. I wonder if there's a little bit of like parallel to it. It doesn't have the words of institution. Well, clearly this is what you're supposed to do, right? But instead, it's a higher level reflection on aspects of it. And I wonder if there's a parallel there to the moral life.
I don't know, my takeaway is that I hear a lot of words in here about love, about unity, and about serving. And I wonder why our Christian communities are so bad at it. Because I don't think that's what people see when they see Christians. And I wonder, given that I feel like this gospel is, kind of theological, but also mystical in that way. And therefore, in a way, not looking to the ethic perhaps as Harry said, but more inviting us into a mystery. And I wonder why we're so afraid to do that, because those signs that he does through this gospel, and then these words that are particularly driven for me in this gospel. I just feel like we back away from them because they call too much out of us.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder why we're so afraid of them.
Yeah, Leah, as you said that, I'm reminded of what Jesus says, I think a couple of times in this gospel, which is, if I had not come, it was essentially like, if I had not come, you would not have sinned or something. It's like, if I hadn't come, you wouldn't have known. And so I think there might be some sense of like, even though we do know, right, we like, it has been revealed. If there's some sense of like, we don't look too much, knowing that to look is to see the light, is to know, and to see one's own shortcomings, and in this case, the shortcomings of our communities.
Can I also add, it's probably helpful also to look at First John as a commentary on the Gospel of John. It comes from the same basic place. And so I was trying to think, well, yeah, what's the teaching of First John there? Well, that's where we have, God is love. He who says he is in the light and hates his brother is in the darkness still. He who loves his brother abides in the light and in it. So yeah, you see again that what is like the basic contour about love. God is love of God, love of neighbor, and of faith, and the connection between them. Yeah, so I don't know. I that's not saying much because it's very similar to the Gospel of John, but it seems to very much not be an accident that it's that side of things that's being
That
emphasized.
feels like it's so hard to, I mean, I don't feel like the love is a word that we understand very well. And I feel like it's a mystical thing that we want to put parameters around in some way to make it possible for us in a weird way. I feel like the mystics understand it better than we do. And so I think that that's one of the reasons I find John both, I don't know, scary might be the right word. It's the mystery of the call of that gospel, and then consoling at the same time. It feels really powerful to me. And and those words just keep resonating for me because those are places that can be touchstones for me, even in my small and imperfect way. I can move toward those, as those are words that Jesus invites me to embrace.
Mhm.
Yeah, I can say one thing just from a little bit later in chapter 13. One thing that I think is really interesting is this, I guess this is the sort of same thing you said, but like 13:34 is, as I have loved you, so you also should love one another. And that being like love is like love not is some, like abiding human reality that has always existed, but actually some new historical thing that Jesus doesn't say, oh, I'm just reminding you. I'm reminding you to love. In case you forget, just here to say it again. But it's like the advent of some new sort of human possibility. I find that really interesting.
Well put.
Epoch shift.
Yeah, I'm reminded of in Benedict's chapter on this, he writes about the relationship between love. Oh, sorry, what is it? Love your neighbor as yourself and love one another as I have loved you. And the distinction there was with, of course, love your neighbor as yourself coming from Leviticus and are primarily from Leviticus. And without putting too fun of a point on it, he just talks about how the new commandment, this love one another as I have loved you, isn't an intensification in degree. And he talks about how many of us could say that the 10 Commandments is just the basic stuff. It's just a given. No, right? The 10 Commandments are in some way complete in themselves, and certainly have enough material and enough difficulty to occupy us for a human lifetime. But nonetheless, what shifts is I think what you were pointing to is the mystical reality. What you're pointing to is what about this is epoch shifting. It's it is the person of Christ and the possibility of unity to the person of Christ as the inner movement out of which those other things come from, or out of which any particular action comes from. Which goes back to, I'm reminded of, Pope Francis talking about encounter or something that there's this fundamental moment or of recognition in the way that the Gospel of John talks about it, or a faith, that recognition is the thing here that is different, that Christ is God, and is one with the Father. And that is both somehow continuous, but also totally new and different than anything we've read before. And any of the commands to love that we've read before, because love isn't the thing that's itself the thing that's new, but yet somehow we get the sense that this is entirely new.
The way you guys are talking about that reminds me, I wonder if we should be seeing a parallel with the way life is talked about. This is the source of life, and I'm especially thinking of Benedict's commentary on this, page 84 and 85, that life that in Greek is zoe as opposed to bios, is entirely new. And but Jesus is talking about is like life, even so this eternal life, we're invited not to see as like, oh yeah, it's like this one, except it's on the other side of death. But no, this life that people can participate in, even who are going to die, including Christ, which is also, even for them, present right now. So yeah, and so yeah, maybe there's a, with different things, including love and life. Maybe there's the from above. There's a version from above that Christ invites us into, which is its fulfillment. Yeah, it seems like that's what we're invited to see.
Certainly Jesus endows the meaning of love with a new profound meaning, the notion of love, the love with a new profound meaning. And I think what one of the dimensions of that is he tells us not to let the fear of death circumscribe the extent of our love, that the love that we have for one another should not be limited by a fear of us losing our own lives. And that's to me what is really new in the gospel, in the whole passion story.
I was thinking here, we're saying that like this is a totally new thing, and yet at the same time somehow also a development of what went before. Like how can it, be both? And I was thinking about the the caterpillar to butterfly analogy. It's like if you had never seen a butterfly and you were told that this caterpillar is going to develop, you could imagine a lot of things. You would probably not imagine a butterfly. That like somehow this butterfly is the development. And yet it's also a totally new order of things. It's a totally new level of development. It is in a way extremely different than the caterpillar, while being its development and fulfillment, without which the caterpillar makes no sense. So just trying to think through this love, and all through the Gospels, the development of like Christ giving the new law as opposed to the old law, all these different concepts, seeing this connection, and yet of such a surprising kind from our human point of view, something so beyond what we could have imagined given the preliminaries.
And also, Mark, when you were saying a love that doesn't fear death, I was also, of course, going back to curse and all of our readings on that as we're puzzling through that. Is it's a love that's willing to take the curse upon itself, and of course the deep connections between that and a lack of fear of death. Yeah,
right. And when Peter cuts off the ear in this, when Jesus says, well, do you think I'm not willing to drink the chalice of the curse of course connected with death? I wonder if we should start to share any thoughts now that we've had about especially the high priestly prayer here, like the emphasis of Emma's presentation, and maybe anything else having to do with the farewell discourse in general.
Could I just say one more thing about the very beginning of chapter 13? And I hadn't realized until Emma pointed it out that when you say show his love for them to the end, that was telos, which puts a whole different. I mean, it's been a while since I've studied telos, but it's teleological thinking is a very different way of thinking. So showing your love for them to the telos would be sort of the ultimate development or ultimate fulfillment of love, not just loving them till he gets killed. That sentence has a whole new meaning when you realize that the word for end is telos and not simply the English word end, that there's something about the whole process that his love brings him to this fulfillment, that it is a fulfillment of love. I guess, unless I'm misinterpreting Telos, because it's been a while since I've studied that.
No, I think that's exactly it. And this is Emma's already said this, no, but I think it's worth noting that it's a different, it's just a different form of the same word, that when Christ says on the cross, at his last words, it is finished, sort of like, and it's not like, and this was the last scene, but his death there was the to the end. We're invited to see that as related to the foot washing, that service, and that service, of course, is service in the priestly element that Emma was talking about, and in the sense of service that we're used to. So it's
love. Yeah.
It's like, isn't it amazing that all of this is woven together? I really love that.
Well, when you mentioned Peter cutting off the ear, it reminded me, because I was just reading again that Evil in Person by Jean-Luc Marion that we read before. And there he says that Christ was teaching them to absorb the pain, absorb the suffering, as if you were a goalkeeper blocking a ball, not so nobody else feels the impact, only the the person who is capable of absorbing evil and not carrying it on to the next person, not sharing the evil, not sharing the suffering that come to you, but he absorbs all the suffering. And that's how that's one of the way he shows love. We're not supposed to judge people or have revenge. If we are hurt, just absorb it and let it go.
That reminds me of something. Correct me if I'm wrong, the Simone Weil scholars that are here, but I remember reading somewhere that a quote from her is that we experience good by doing it, and we experience evil by avoiding it. And that's always been a bit of something that I was having a hard time coming to terms with, understanding it. But Mary, just what you just said, it lent some new meaning to that statement for me.
Are you sure it's avoiding it? I think it might be more in line with what she said, by suffering it.
Yeah, I agree. I'm probably not quoting it the right way, but that's the way that would be my interpretation, my understanding as well.
To throw into the hopper another, which might a Simone Weil quote that I think is apropos, the false God turns suffering into violence. The true God turns violence into suffering. I think has to do with also what the way she talks about evil and experience. Which you can only experience evil if you're innocent. Otherwise, you pass it on to someone else who gets to experience it. Oh, the suffering and evil. The false God turns violence into suffering. The true God turns suffering into sorry, the opposite of that. The true God turns violence into suffering. Which I think would be the sense of what Mary and Mark were both saying.
Well, it sort of as a segue, the high priestly prayer. Not to say anything about it, I don't think, just to say it. The chapter 17:14. I gave them your word, and the world hated them, because they do not belong to the world any more than I belong to the world. So that, just like sort of an interesting way to think about like love there in the different sort of life or that is opened up by it. Perhaps like back to the like Bios and Zoe.
and Benedict, one of his quotes there is making the point, that that much like much like Israel being set apart from the nations for the nations, there's the being set against the world for the world dynamic in that same passage.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, I wonder, is there, okay, I forget, is it in the Hebrew that we're invited to see against, like against, not as meaning necessarily like clashing with, but like Adam and Eve against each other? I was wondering about
Yeah.
that. Is there
Yeah,
some of that?
It's like
in
the
this?
I can't remember.
I mean,
what it
obviously
is.
the original here is in Hebrew, but
Scott Hahn writes about it. Yeah, it's like back to back or something. I forget exactly what the
yeah, but in a way
what
you
the
could be
subtle
against the
meaning is.
world with the meaning not being like,
Yeah,
like hitting it,
yeah, yeah.
but in a sense coming from the opposite direction, which might be
Mhm.
what ends up being for the world.
Yeah.
So like you could say that Jesus and Peter in the garden are both against the other folks, but in two very different ways. That Jesus is sort of like the opposite of their violence, whereas Peter is just, he's on the same plane with his sword on the other side. And we Christians are called to be against the world like Jesus did it, not like Peter did it.
Yeah, that would be a good way of putting it. I think it maps onto what Emma was saying earlier about being set apart. By being set apart to be solely for God actually puts one at the service of the world. But so I think we would be invited to see the first part of that movement, or understanding in the first sense. You could understand it as against the world, but that against the world is the only way to be for the world, because it's only that which could participate in, I think, what we were just talking about a couple minutes ago with Mary and Mark, what you were saying.
Well, I think sorry, Emma, I think the original language is a bit more helpful, because it's not against, it is like,
Damn.
it is, where one belongs to, or like of course you're of the world, but you're sent from somebody else. Or you
Yeah.
belong to a different place.
Yeah, I just think the world part, and I don't know what the actual word is there, of course, is confusing, because if you think about it as like the world is also being consecrated here. It's like to consecrate the world is another phrase from this same set against it, and ultimately it's to consecrate it. And of course, thinking about the little
Yeah.
blurb that I drew out there about like creation as a space for covenant. It's like,
Of course.
yeah, putting it back on, but of course
Yeah.
the world
Because
means different.
but to be sent from, you're also sent to.
Yeah,
I think that's
Yeah.
helpful there.
yeah. That's good.
There's that old usage, like even in English, we're like set over against, which can simply just be like a positional. So like if they're describing a landscape, somebody's house would be set over against somebody else's house on the opposite side of the stream or whatever. I don't think that usage is really used anymore, but even there, it's, doesn't quite have the same sense that we would give to the word in current usage.
Yeah. And if so, then I guess we would, if this is a real thread here, then I guess we'd be invited to say all of the times where Jesus is from the Father, not from the world, it's from the Father. It would I guess also supposed to maybe pop out in the same way. I'm curious about, other people's responses to the high priestly prayer. And Mark, I'm especially interested in your, because the idea of, priesthood and atonement sacrifice, I know that you wanted to talk earlier about
Renee Girard.
Renee Girard, and who makes a long argument against understanding Jesus in that way, which I only know just a little bit of, but I was wondering if you had put these things in dialogue with each other at all, or had been thinking about this.
Well, I wish I could speak to that with some authority. I think Renee Girard's perspective on the passion and the sacrifice and the idea of the scapegoat and the victimization of Jesus, his willingness to accept that is an indispensable, for me, it has been an indispensable perspective on understanding the gospel, because it So I wish I could speak to it with a little more authority. I would like to, go into Rene Girard's thinking a little more, because what he does have to say about the passion and the idea of the scapegoat becomes a kind of a key for me to understanding. He's willing to take on the sins of the world and accept the idea of the notion of being, a scapegoat. I'm trying to find a better word for it, but that's the one. That's what Girard uses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess something I'm curious about would be whether if we make all the distinctions that I think especially Benedict is helping us to make here, so that we're not understanding Jesus in the logic of substitutionary sacrifice. Like Jesus was the scapegoat, so now so the rest of us are okay because it was Jesus and not the lamb. But these other understanding, I mean, especially participation, but also these non-cultic flavors too that mix with the cultic. I wonder I wonder if taking that into account, these could be squared, what you're saying and what Benedict is drawing out here.
I wish I was more prepared to really kind of address the question. I'm not, can I take an assignment home with me and
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Even if
Yeah.
it's like to recommend some particular things you think we should all read, you
Yeah,
can
yeah.
make them up. So that would be great.
Actually, in Mother Foucault, we saw just the book on this.
Yeah,
Actually,
yeah.
Okay. I will post that. I will post that in the Agronomics University forum. There's a series of talks that interviews with Rene Girard that were conducted on the Canadian broadcast system. There's one in particular, I think it's the third of them, that really kind of elucidates his thinking and his understanding, because what Girard has done has identified, well, I can't speak to it, so I'm not going to try to get into it at this point, but he does provide a different perspective on the gospel than anything that I had ever heard before. And I'm fumbling for the words, but I promise I'll come back with a little more cogent thought next time around.
I apologize on Bert's behalf for putting you on the spot.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
And also, someone else has put in there's a man whose last name is Girard in the room here
Who's we're
Said-
he's offering some commentaries. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was also, one thing that I was just amazed by when reading this is even just the very first line. And for folks who read the other volume of Jesus of Nazareth with us, like we know that Pope Benedict makes a lot of this when he talks about the relationship between the Son and the Father. So it was kind of prepared for it, but nonetheless, like Jesus kind of pausing from his action, lifting up his eyes to heaven and saying to the Father, just some like seeing like the words of Jesus speaking to the Father. It just sort of like encountering that, it sort of blows my mind. Again, when we're thinking about the life of the Trinity and what like the mystery of the relationship between the Son and the Father.
What blows my
Yeah.
mind about that is that, like, I should really be thinking about this when we have the Eucharistic prayer at Mass. Yeah, and I think especially like the petitions in Mass, and especially in the Easter Vigil, the petitions where that goes sort of outward, concentric circles outward. It's like, oh, this logic is here.
Yeah. And actually, one thing that the Catechism draws out, and I didn't share the Catechism sections on this chapter, but they're really good. Well, mainly because they use the word recapitulation a few times, but they are really good. And one of the points that the Catechism makes is that if you follow this, this is sort of Jesus's answer to and fulfillment of the petitions of the Our Father. And you can see some really beautiful echoes in the language between the Our Father and in this high priestly prayer. So both like modeling how we are to pray, and now here's Jesus praying it to the Father with those same petitions in a way that, because he is the Son, is also bringing that about. So something I want to meditate some more on. I thought it was okay.
Well, we can continue any reflections that come from the high priestly prayer and Emma's presentation, and then also just opening it up to the trial, the passion, resurrection, things that came to your reading there. I could start off with something that so in a commentary that I had never thought of before, and I wonder if it's on point, that that Peter post-resurrected, his where he's invited to sort of make up for his 3 denials with his 3 I don't know what you would say, his 3
Confessions of faith.
confessions of faith. Thank you. That Peter uses a lower grade word for love than Jesus did, that we might be invited to say that Peter is not exactly taking up. So it's with one word being agape.
Like Jesus saying agape.
Jesus is saying, do you love me like this? And Peter says, sort of like friendly love in a way that is
Yeah.
potentially a diminished form. And then Jesus meets him the last time by using that phrase himself. And then Peter meets that. So yeah, are we being invited to see Peter even at the end as not understanding Christ?
Or maybe it's just that Peter finally is a humbler man with more self-awareness than, his boastfulness ahead of time. It's like, I'll die for you. Everyone else is going to run away. And here he's like, well, Lord, you know that I love you.
You know that we're buddies. Why you got to ask more?
But maybe I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not, given all that's just happened, am I qualified to say that I do? I don't know. It is an interesting point.
Yeah, and the commentary there was also talking about, because we were reading the same one. I think part of the point Jesus was making there too is that Peter, of course, isn't loving to the end yet. And Benedict makes the argument that loving to the end is like the essential content of the word agape, even though there are, of course, multiple words, that loving to the end sort of is what agape is. And that Peter at this point is not yet loving to the end, right? He will love to the end. He will give his life for Christ, but he's not there yet. So I appreciate that reading, Malcolm. I hadn't had to put those 2 things together before. Yeah, and also in the context of thinking about, I know I mentioned this earlier, but in the context of thinking about cleanness, yeah, or I think just having read Leviticus now, of course, cleanness has such a richer set of meanings and connections for me than it did when I've been reading the Gospel without reading the Old Testament. And especially, yeah, that scene where the Jewish leaders aren't willing to enter the praetorium but they are willing to condemn Christ to death, shouting, crucify him, and not seeing those things as that one would disqualify you from participating in the Passover, but not the other. Because I was just, really taken with that fact as the sign of exactly what the breakdown is here in this moral order of the Old Covenant, at least in its very disintegrated form. That, and along with, especially with our reading of First Kings, thinking about when they say, Caesar is our king, Caesar's our only king, too, and thinking about the threads there that we see again of this disintegration.
Well, I don't know if anyone had it in their commentaries, but I've always been struck by like the you think about the Old Testament where it's kind of ambivalent, where they want a king, right? Where they want a king like all the other nations have a king. And God says, this is like, I'll give you a king, but this is no good. Your king certainly is not supposed to be like the other nations. And then when Solomon goes and becomes very much like all the other kings, accumulates gold and wealth and too many wives for himself, he is, cursed by God for that. But that Barabbas is like, there's an old manuscript tradition that when Pilate says, do you want Jesus the Messiah, basically, or do you want Jesus Barabbas, that they had the same first name and very similar titles? Barabbas means son of the Father. And that also that word like robber, basically he was a zealot insurrectionary. So not like on the one hand, they're saying that like we have no king but Caesar, but that's obviously nonsense. None of them like Caesar. But in this choice here, what they are doing is again choosing a king, or what they hope will be a king, like all the other nations have one. This Barabbas guy, because like just seeing him as like an ordinary criminal doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if he's a messianic figure of his own type, then it actually makes a considerable amount more sense, and gives kind of more of an irony to them saying like we have no king but Caesar, even as they're like demanding the freedom of this, resistance fighter type. I've always thought that was it. And thinking about us, like here we are, like we're all in that crowd, and do we want Jesus or do we want our own kind of Messiah? And of course, that could be a lot of different kinds of Messiah. But would we prefer to have some other type? And like, if it really is true that like in the earliest manuscripts, they have the same first name, like here they are. I thought that was really interesting.
Really well put, Malcolm. Yeah. No, I think we are invited to see that.
Yeah, and one commentary I was reading, it was also talking about how, I had never thought about this before, that it's like Jesus's followers could have gone to be in the crowd and saying, no, we want Jesus Christ. Like there could have been a kind of counter voice here, especially with the logic of like the vox populi in the way the Roman system of governance worked, that there could have been this counter movement to try to save Christ by these other means. And you have this parallel moment where it's the crowd saying, we want Jesus Barabbas, and Peter is there denying Jesus, and they're like split screen sort of scenes.
Mm-hmm.
Then also I just never put those things together, that like, oh wait, that like this voice of the crowd is actually like a legal mechanism, and actually there could have been a different turn of events here, and that Peter sort of is the living counterpart to that. I never appreciated that before.
Yeah, so I was thinking about the split screen part there, but I hadn't put that part of it here. Yeah, I think we're invited to say that, Jesus' disciples instead were denying him, and that's
Yeah.
Isn't that like the original like the thumbs up, thumbs down thing in the circus, when like the crowd would decide whether someone lives or dies? And that's what I heard, where that thumbs up or thumbs down a symbol actually came from initially.
Another thing, maybe way to solicit final comments here. General thoughts about the Gospel of John after this reading. General, I mean, I feel like Leah, like your comment earlier is sort of that, like,
And Harry
what was
too.
this?
Yeah.
What was this reading like in general? This is our last week on John.
I had a question about one of the, in 17, verse 5, that ends with, glorify me in thy own presence with the glory which I had with thee before the world was made. Can you have any comment on that?
It made me think of the prologue.
Well, I mean, just there are other verses around this. So I came from the Father and returning to the Father. You get that sort of that completion of the loop type of, like another way of putting that in terms of glory, perhaps. Was there a particular thing that was
Well, before the world was made, so he's is it saying that he's been thinking of this, before the world was made, before Adam and Eve were, how far back has he been contemplating his crucifixion?
Well, I mean, we are invited to say the word, the prologue of John, the world was made through the word. Nothing was made that wasn't made through the word. But the sacrament, what Jesus is doing here has to do with with worship and spirit and truth. So a type of sacrifice that in a sense corresponds with. So we're sorry, this is going back to some other commentary that we didn't actually talk about. But there's worship in spirit and truth, or in word and truth, that we're invited to see Christ is doing here, that uses some of the same words that are used for creation.
Just to fasten into something Mary just said about how long, if Jesus was actually, if he sensed, how long did he think he had before his crucifixion, his passion took place? And I think in the Gospel of John and also the other Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, we see over and over again that Jesus, talks about his time not yet coming. And in John especially, he kind of slips away in a number of instances because it's not, the time isn't right. And I think this is where Rene Girard would plug in, because I think Jesus understands the ritual of sacrifice. And when Caiaphas says, it's better that one should die than everybody, the entire community suffer, he is being singled out. And Jesus understands this dynamic, that he's going to be the sacrificial lamb. He's going to, this idea of mimetic desire has reached his crescendo to a point where people are furious with him, even though he has some defenders. He knows the mob is going to come after him. And this is a matter of sensing the moment. And I think that that's where his intelligence, his ability to discern when this moment is coming, reaches a point at the Last Supper. Really, he knows it's on its way, and he's braced himself for it because of this kind of frenzied mob that's coming up. Anyway, that I'm not articulating it very well, but I'll put my words together a little better next time.
We're about at the end of our time here. Realize one thing we didn't talk about at all, which we won't be able to now, but if you're still reading it, maybe to pay more attention to than we have here, would be the Holy Spirit, the giving of the Spirit. So we were tracking that in things that Jesus was saying about being born again of water and the Spirit. Life Jesus from the temple and from Christ flows life-giving water, which is the Spirit, which it says in chapter 8 or 9 that the Spirit hadn't yet been given because Christ had not yet been glorified. So now we're at the point where the Spirit is going to be given, but that requires Christ to be glorified, which for John is lifted up. So anyway, and then of course the water and blood from the side of Christ. And so we haven't been tracking this in our commentary here, but certainly worth thinking about as we read the end of John, if we're still reading it.
The preview of the next few weeks. So we'll be back in 2 Kings for a few more weeks. So we'll be starting the disintegration of the kingdom and ending with capture of both the northern and the southern kingdoms by the end of our reading for next week. But we'll also be reading if we need sort of a break from that too, we'll also be reading the Song of Solomon, which also be really beautiful over the next basically 2 weeks.
I thought we'll be reading First Kings.
Oh, sorry, yes, First Kings, Second Chronicles, sorry. And just to note that the Second Chronicles material covers the same content as First Kings. So it looks like a lot of reading, but a lot of it is very repetitive. So use your judgment in terms of how to where to focus your time there. And then after that, of course, with the captivity and the exile will then bring us to the prophets. Maybe prophets in a few weeks. Well, we'll see you all on Saturday or next week. Peace.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everybody. Hope you feel better, Emma.
Thanks. Bye.